Hello, Jacksonites, and take two this time. Hopefully, I'll be successful. Welcome to my ranking the Gamera franchise video. Uh, as stated last time, I was so inspired after reviewing Gamera the Brave that I just decided, fuck it, let's start to put some finishing touches on Super Kaiju Binge. So upon completing reviewing the entire Gamera franchise, again, I was so inspired to give all the Gameras a rewatch and listen to all the commentaries on the Arrow video set, which were all, well, no, most of them were enjoyable. I'll talk about those as I go on. But yeah, upon rewatching all the Gamera films and putting together a definitive list, I have decided that today I am going to be ranking the entire Gamera franchise from worst to best. And of course, I was also so inspired, I decided to write an intro speech for you guys, which took me, now it's taken me about 3 weeks to polish and touch up. So without further ado, without any beating around the bush, let us jump into it. The 1950s, and especially the 1960s, truly were the golden age for giant monster movies. Beginning with the release of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms in 1953, and truly exploding with the release of the original Gojira the following year, the entire world would be swept up at some certain point in time in the giant monster movie craze, until the late 1960s, when said giant monster movie craze would be contained to mostly Japan. Following the release of Gojira, numerous giant monster movies would be released to cash in on the success of guys in rubber monster suits destroying miniature city sets and occasionally fighting other guys in rubber suits. Wink, wink. Of the 50s, we would have Varan the Unbelievable, The Giant Behemoth, 20 Million Miles to Earth, Tarantula, Rodan, The Giant Claw. Yes, that counts. It has a giant monster in it, amongst many other things, too. But the 1960s especially had a huge smorgasbord of giant monster movies. Gorgo, Mothra, Gappa the Triphibian Monster, The X from Outer Space, the resurrection and continuation of the Godzilla series, beginning with King Kong vs. Godzilla in 1962, which also brought back King Kong after a massive 29-year hiatus. King Kong Escapes, South Korea's Yongari Monster from the Deep, Denmark's Reptilicus, Frankenstein vs. Baragon, and the creation of the Ultra series with the subsequent releases of the original Ultra Q, Ultraman, and Ultra 7 shows, respectively, so on and so forth. As mentioned earlier, with the dawn of the 1970s, giant monster movies would be almost exclusively contained to Japan for a little while, with the continuation of the Showa Godzilla series and the continuation of the Ultra series, and as well as the introduction of the Kamen Rider and Super Sentai franchises. This would, of course, lead to the subsequent tokusatsu boom, in which many Japanese studios would try to cash in on the success of Ultraman, Kamen Rider, and Super Sentai, which that is a huge rabbit hole in and of itself, so let's save that for another time. The only American release of giant monster movies I can think of off the top of my head is the 1976 remake of King Kong, which for a long time was the last giant monster movie that was at least of major note released in America. And with the massive underperformance of its sequel, King Kong Lives, a full decade later, this would prove that American audiences had moved on to the preference of big-budget Hollywood blockbusters like Jaws and Star Wars, and independent/semi-notable horror movies like Phantasm, Halloween, and Alien. Though, to be somewhat fair, monsters certainly were still a thing in movies and TV shows, but on a much more human scale, spawned ironically somewhat by the success of Jaws and Alien, like with John Carpenter's The Thing, Predator, The Blob, Gremlins, and Aliens, and horror anthology TV shows like Goosebumps, Are You Afraid of the Dark, Tales from the Dark Side, and Monsters. However, outside of Godzilla and Ultraman, all of these previous 50s and 60s monster movies and characters I've mentioned have either fallen into obscurity or were restricted to their sole film appearance as their 15 minutes of fame. This isn't inherently a bad thing, as many are still fondly remembered, especially amongst fellow monster movie fans. Varan and Rodan, especially, would be absorbed into the larger Godzilla franchise and would become semi regular supporting characters. Mothra would also be absorbed into the Godzilla franchise, but she herself would get a trilogy of solo movies of her own with the somewhat infamous Rebirth of Mothra trilogy in the late 1990s. 20,000 Leagues and 20 Million Miles would be fondly talked about amongst fans of the legendary Ray Harryhausen. Gorgo would grow a dedicated cult following in the decades to come, fueled by continuous comic book series that would keep Gorgo in monster movie fans' minds. And films like Reptilicus and The X from Outer Space would become infamous in the giant monster movie circle for how poor and ineptly made they turned out, and would be hailed as some of the best so bad they're good films ever made. And finally, King Kong would get more films, but at an extremely sporadic and semi-successful rate, before also being somewhat absorbed into the Godzilla franchise. With all that being said, there was another giant monster that was unleashed onto the world during the 1960s that managed to escape the realm of obscurity and managed to carve out a name for itself and become a global icon in its own right, for a while anyway, and for a few of the wrong reasons, became a fairly infamous figure in the kaiju community. And that monster is, of course, the Invincible, the King of the Turtles, the real hero in a half shell with real turtle power, the Guardian of the Universe, Gamera, the 200-foot flying, fire-breathing turtle. Debuting November 27th, 1965, happy 60th anniversary to Gamera. After a disastrous production about a giant killer rat movie in the style of The Food of the Gods, the first Gamera film, Gamera the Giant Monster, was a surprise smash hit at the box office, with Gamera captivating audiences with his loud screeching roar, his flashing underbit tusks, his bright white fire breath, and his awe-inspiring ability to make people believe that turtles can fly. This success is quite surprising, as Gamera was released around the time when Godzilla ripoffs were quite prominent, Gorgo, Gappa, and Aegon the Atomic Dragon being the main examples that come to mind, which the first Gamera film is undoubtedly a Godzilla ripoff. Godzilla and Gamera both started out as villains with heavy nuclear weapon and Cold War tension allegories and themes. Both started out in black and white solo films. Both would receive heavily modified Americanized cuts of their original films. Both fought a monster in each of their second movies. Both monsters' first adversaries were four-legged spiny monsters with horns on their noses. Both monsters would fight their first foes in the presence of the Osaka Castle. Both monsters would have a flying pteranodon-like monster become recurring characters in their respective franchises. And both Gamera and Godzilla started out in the Showa series as villains and would progressively become monster superheroes. I could go on as the similarities are almost endless, but the point being, is that Gamera undoubtedly was heavily inspired by the Godzilla franchise, both intentionally and unintentionally. However, just because something is a ripoff, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing. As stated, Gamera was able to carve out his own name and reputation as a much more child oriented, wacky, bonkers, and insane acid trip with some of the most ridiculous, violent, gory, and outlandish monsters seen in fiction. And this is coming from somebody who's a huge fan of Ultraman, so that statement is saying something. In the following subsequent years, throughout the 1960s, Gamera would have a new installment in his franchise going on until 1971. The OG Showa series peaking early with 1967's Gamera vs. Gauss in terms of quality, which that year was the peak of the 3-year-long peak of the 60s kaiju boom and saw the release of the most kaiju films in one year, with Son of Godzilla, King Kong Escapes, Gamera vs. Gauss, The X from Outer Space, Yongari, Monster from the Deep, Gap of the Triphibian Monster, and the original Ultra 7 all seeing the light of day that year. And to clarify, this is compared to 1965, seeing the release of Frankenstein vs. Baragon, Gamera the Giant Monster, and Invasion of the Astro Monster. In 1966, seeing the release of Gamera vs. Baragon, War of the Gargantuas, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, and the original Ultra Q and Ultraman. If you don't count the original Daimajin trilogy, which technically that makes 66 the peak of the 3-year-long peak, but if you don't, it goes to 1967. Still, though, 1967 was truly a special year for kaiju films. Afterwards, though, due to the studio who owned Gamera, Dai Studios' continuous stupidity in terms of financial decisions and filmmaking decisions, i.e., using real infected sewer rats with lice, ticks, and fleas to use for a movie, being definitely a dead giveaway of a lot of stupidity. Afterwards, the franchise would stoop to some of the lowest of lows for monster films, with cheap special effects, piss-poor monster battles, annoying, uninteresting, and paper-thin human casts, and copious amounts of stock footage that would turn Gamera into nearly a self-parody of the kaiju genre as a whole, especially once Gamera Super Monster rolled around in 1980, which sealed the coffin on the Gamera franchise for a whopping 15 years after its overwhelming box office failure. Another comparison to Godzilla is, of course, Gamera would receive the reboot treatment in the mid-1990s with the Shizuke Kaneko Gamera trilogy. Of course, him being the same guy who would later go on to direct Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. Yep, that title just doesn't get any easier to say. Which did succeed in reviving Gamera for a more modern audience and undo a lot of the damage done by Gamera Super Monster and cement Gamera as a worthy kaiju, in the wide pop culture ether. And again, another comparison to Godzilla and repeating the same move done by the Heisei trilogy, the Gamera franchise would be rebooted again, and after being purchased and absorbed by the studio Kadokawa Pictures and a failed crossover with said Godzilla franchise, in 2006 we would see the release of Gamera the Brave. But this was an earnest attempt to bring the Gamera franchise to more of the Showa series roots by bringing back the focus on kids and a more lighthearted and campy tone, while keeping the top-notch effects and production value. Though sadly, Gamera the Brave was released at the absolute worst possible time, and it was in the thickest of thick, bottom of the barrel rock bottom of the Great Kaiju Drought, starting in 2006 and ending in 2013, discounting the release of Cloverfield and Death Kappa. So unfortunately, afterwards, the Gamera franchise would enter its whopping 17-year-long drought, which for Gamera fans surely was absolute hell to sit through. However, nowadays, in today's kaiju climate, unfortunately, the Gamera franchise as a whole and Gamera himself as a character, in my opinion, both have fallen into what I call franchise stagnation. This phenomenon happens to a film or TV franchise, has its momentum slowing to a complete stop, and then they subsequently simmer and stew in limbo. And after a certain amount of time, the franchise becomes somewhat boring to watch and discuss because nothing new has been added to their pots, so nothing new can be said. Some examples of this include RoboCop, which has been frustratingly dormant since 2014, discounting the release of RoboCop Delta City. I don't really include video games. Pirates of the Caribbean, which has been in limbo since the horrendous disaster that was Dead Men Tell No Tales, and also likely the subsequent abandonment done by Disney of poor Johnny Depp following the Amber Heard bullshit fiasco. Austin Powers, which has been long overdue for 5, 6, or 7 more sequels since 2002. And discounting the reboot TV series, Lethal Weapon hasn't seen a new film since 1998, despite having a new script written for Lethal Weapon 5 and being inspected by and praised by Mel Gibson himself. And arguably the most frustrating of all is the Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th franchises. This is especially frustrating for Gamera because, as I mentioned in my Gamera Rebirth review, following the resurrection of the kaiju genre with the release of Pacific Rim in 2013, we've gotten 9 Godzilla movies and a new Godzilla animated series, with 2, possibly 3 other Godzilla films on the way in the next couple of years, one of which has gotten an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. King Kong has gotten 3 films and 2 new animated series, as well as a comic series, and not 1, but 2 crossovers with Godzilla, and a 3rd on the way. And one of those films has gotten at least an Academy Award nomination. Ultraman has finally been unleashed upon the world, with nearly the entire franchise getting readily available DVD and Blu-ray releases for the first time in the entire history of the Ultraman series. Super Sentai got 14 installments of its franchise released by Shout Factory over an 8-year period, although sadly that got cut short by Hasbro and their desire to keep Power Rangers stuck in the past, but still surely Sentai fans were quite happy for a while. The Metal Hero series, which is another franchise that suffers from franchise stagnation, although that's somewhat being mediated a bit because it's finally getting some exposure and new fans through Discotech putting out quite a few of its installments over the last couple of years, giving context to shows like VR Troopers and Big Bad Beetleborgs. And Kamen Rider has finally been getting a more international push from Toei, with Discotech and Shout Factory putting out quite a few seasons of Kamen Rider on Blu-ray over the last couple of years, after over 50 years of Toei gatekeeping the franchise to only one specific country and territory, and is finally embracing the success the Ultraman franchise is enjoying by finally embracing similar methods that Tsuburaya employs to promote their products. Even if this too feels like it's a forcing of hands decision made by also Hasbro severing ties with them over Power Rangers, but hey, if that's what it takes, then I'll take it because I want some Kamen Rider in the States, damn it. Excuse me, fixing my shirt. On a brief side note, this frustration can be easily applied to slasher and horror movie fans. In recent years, we've gotten a new trilogy of Halloween sequels, a new splattery and batshit crazy Texas Chainsaw Massacre requel, with another Chainsaw film on the way, even if the rights are in a bidding war. Still, there's another one coming. A new Scream TV series and 2 new sequels released, with another sequel on the way, barring any more salary dispute controversies. We've gotten 2 new films, a 3-season TV series, and a fantastic remake in the Child's Play series. And this isn't a slasher series, sort of, but we got a solid 3-season continuation of the Evil Dead series with Ash vs. Evil Dead, and a new theatrical film in Evil Dead Rise with Evil Dead Burn on the way very soon. And also the newest new installment in a beloved horror franchise would be Final Destination Bloodlines, released just this year. But despite all this resurgence in classic slasher franchises, the poor Friday the 13th and especially the Nightmare on Elm Street franchises are just wallowing in limbo, with both fan bases begging for new installments. But no, the owners would rather keep one franchise continuously stuck in court battles and have its iconic character be used as a marketing mascot for a brand of beer that nobody gives 2 fucks about. And yes, I am aware that apparently Jason is set to make a return in some new movie, but details on that are being kept under extreme and ungodly irritating tight wraps. So I find it extremely difficult to get interested. And especially keep the other franchise under the shadow of its inarguably inferior remake and just choosing to keep banking off of the name of its character and IP and nothing else. Now, granted, I will admit, even though the atmosphere and vibes are very enjoyable and infectious, we can all admit that the new amount of content has definitely been a bit hit or miss. But still, after so long of all these other franchises wallowing in limbo themselves and getting fresh new exposure to modern audiences, it's such a shame that certain properties that you'd think would also flourish in this new day and age, they just continuously, almost intentionally, miss out on getting a piece of the new action, which is extremely frustrating. But after 19 years, what has Kadokawa done for poor Gamera? A 4-minute trailer in 2015, which inexplicably garnered no interest in a new film, despite it being pretty awesome and action-packed. So I find that very hard to believe myself. And admittedly, Kick-Ass Deluxe Blu-ray release of all 12 movies from Arrow Video, which, of course, I do have. And I'm so very thankful to have this in my collection. Still weighs like 10 pounds. And an underwhelming, frustrating, ultimately unwanted, and unnecessary 6-episode animated miniseries that did absolutely nothing to cement Gamera in the modern day kaiju landscape, except A, rip off and copy what Netflix did with the Godzilla Earth trilogy by using the same writers, same director, and same shitty animation style, and B, possibly even further sink the franchise and character into obscurity. Sure, yes, obviously, Gamera has gotten a new installment finally in its franchise after 17 years with Gamera Rebirth, but said series rehashed 5 previous kaiju from its roster, rehashed many elements from the Showa and especially Heisei series, and like stated before, its hype seemed to come and go in the snap of a finger, with absolutely no word on a continuation of the series in any way, or any word on a new film whatsoever. And with the latest news of Kadokawa now re-releasing the first 3 Gamera movies on 4K in Japan only, because of course, instead of doing a new film to celebrate the Giant Turtles' 60th anniversary, it just seems to me that Kadokawa is perfectly content with re-releasing the same shit with only slightly different coats of paint occasionally, and just capitalizing off the name Gamera and nothing else. Just like with what Warner Brothers is doing with the Nightmare on Elm Street series. To me, all of this teasing and hesitation to embrace this new climate of kaiju fans and kaiju films makes Kadokawa come off as a bunch of cowardly chicken shits afraid of taking any kind of risk with their product. On a quick side note, despite the fact that in 2005, when they released The Great Yokai War, which was a sequel to the Yokai Monsters trilogy from the 1960s, despite that movie being a huge hit, they still waited another 16 years to make another Yokai Monsters movie with a surprise cameo from Daimajin. Despite that, too, it just also seemed to fly under everybody else's radar. And this risk, I'm pretty sure, is quite unfounded, as I'm sure kaiju fans would love to see a new live action Gamera film released alongside Godzilla Minus 2 and Godzilla X Kong Supernova, and even Shin Godzilla 2 if the rumor on that is actually true. No rhyme intended. I still firmly stand by the opinion that Toho needs to make a bid to purchase Gamera from Kadokawa and absorb him and all his opponents into the greater Toho kaiju echelon, and give us a Godzilla and Gamera team-up film with various Godzilla and Gamera kaiju doing battle. Godzilla and Gamera versus Iris and Destroya. Godzilla and Gamera versus Mechagodzilla and Mecha Gamera. Godzilla versus a flock of Gauss, Gamera versus Biollante, Anguirus versus Guiron, Baragon versus Barugon, Toto and Manila versus Gabara and Zetus, and King Ghidorah versus Queen Legion. The possibilities are there. The films write themselves. Fans would flock frothing at the mouth, and the money is just waiting to be made. But no. But despite all that, Gamera does still continue to entertain and enthrall. And obviously, Gamera is still talked about to this day due to his impact on the kaiju genre being felt by many, and his own influence on many kaiju and tokusatsu projects in the coming years after the Showa series and especially the Heisei series release. Excuse me. And Gamera continues to inspire and influence many people, including Guillermo del Toro, whom considers Gamera the Giant Monster and Gamera vs. Baragon to be some of his favorite giant monster movies of all time, and Ken Watanabe, who of course played Dr. Serizawa in the Monsterverse, who actually preferred Gamera over Godzilla in his youth, and myself, of course. While I do freely admit that, in my opinion, the Gamera franchise has never surpassed the Godzilla franchise, and I also believe that the Gamera franchise is one of the most poorly handled kaiju properties in existence. And also, despite what some other kaiju snobs may think about me and my opinions, I do call myself a big fan of the Terrible Terrapin. Both Gamera, Barugan, and Queen Legion I consider to be some of my favorite giant monsters in the kaiju franchise. And 5 out of the 12 Gamera films I now consider to be some of my favorite monster movies of all time. And it's because of this love and adoration of the King of the Turtles that leads to my frustration and distaste with how the current owners of Gamera are handling both the character and franchise. There clearly is a want and desire for more Gamera content, and there is a dedicated fan base for the giant turtle, so why can't we have more? So, to celebrate the Diamond 60th anniversary of the King of the Turtles, join me as I rank for the possible final time, if nothing else is ever released, with the entirety of the gap with a ranking. God damn it. Join me as I rank the entirety of the Gamera franchise. um So, jumping right into the list. Damn it, I didn't pull it up. Okay, so jumping right into it. So, I did shop around for a little while, checking out a bunch of other people's ranking of the Gamera franchise videos, like in before and after Gamera Rebirth came out. Um, And many people seem to agree that the weakest of the franchise is one certain installment. And of course, me being me, I tend to subvert expectations. Because if you remember my Gamera reviews back in 2021, I stated that this, in fact, is the weakest of the series. And after watching all 12 movies, yeah, my opinion still reigns the same. At number 13, the bottom of the barrel, is Gamera versus Zigra. This movie just sucks. It's one of the worst monster movies ever made in the entire history of the genre. It's painfully boring. It's painfully cheap. The characters are ungodly annoying and ungodly basic. Uh, the special effects are extremely inconsistent, leaning more so on the side of being negative, unfortunately. At times, it looks almost unfinished with how lazy, sloppy, and lethargically this is put together. And if you remember, I talked about how I'm got through this movie after 3 tries. Well, this most recent rewatch, I did sit through it in one sitting, but I fell asleep halfway through for like half an hour, so I had to rewind what I missed, much to my chagrin. Yeah, this movie is a complete snooze. The real biggest thing that kills this movie. So, Zigra is a cool monster. That's what everybody says about this movie. He looks cool. He's got a cool design, but that's it. Zigra himself, aside from having a cool design, is still a very basic alien invader monster, like whoop-de-doo. He's and that one big criticism that this movie has that I still stand by is that this is the movie that rips off Gamera versus Virus way more than Gamera versus Guiron does. And Zigra's personality is quite similar, and his motivation wanting to take over the seas of the world is a bit different, but he still wants to conquer the world and use humans as food or slaves. It's nothing new. It's the same as Virus's motivations in Gamera versus Virus. And a lot of people, again, they like to praise Zigra. I mean, yeah, he does look cool, but one cool monster is not enough to save this movie. There are two scenes that I do think are entertaining. One being when Gamera goes down in the ocean to save a bathysphere, and he has this cheeky little hide and seek moment, and then throws a little rock at Zigra while he's asleep. And then, of course, there's the infamous moment where Gamera sticks a rock on Zigra's nose, causing him to fall over, and Gamera proceeds to play his own theme song on Zigra's back like a xylophone. Which, fun fact, I was watching this movie with my son right before I reviewed it, and that xylophone scene was the very first scene in a movie that actually made Roman laugh. No bullshit. So that was enjoyable. But yeah, those two little moments, they don't save this movie. It seriously is one of the absolute worst monster movies. It may honestly be in at least the top 10 of the worst for monster movies. It's just terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And speaking of which, coming in right below that is Gamera versus Virus. Oh, by the way, the commentary on the Arrow set, there was two commentators for Gamera versus Zigra, and I could tell that towards the end of it, the two were kind of struggling to come up with stuff to talk about regarding the movie. And I definitely see why, because the film is just such a snooze. Yeah, Gamera versus Virus coming in at number 12 is also a complete snooze. Excuse me, hang on. Taking my boots off. Okay. Yeah, unlike Gamera versus Zigra, which is oh god, that feels so much better, which is coma-inducing boring. Gamera versus Virus, which does suffer from a lot of the same issues as Gamera versus Zigra, it looks cheap. It is extremely hackneyed and very uninspired. It's very basic and plain and simple to a fault. It has annoying human characters and very boring human characters too. But unlike Gamera versus Zigra, which is coma-inducing boring, Gamera versus Virus is boring, but it's frustratingly boring because it had a sliver of potential to at least be somewhat decent, but it was hampered by a low budget, poor studio decisions, and the sign of things to come for the rest of the Gamera franchise that it was going to be a rocky road from here on out. Virus is hands down my least favorite Gamera kaiju of the entire franchise. He's kaiju Squidward. Seriously, like whoop-de-fucking-do. I would much rather see Gamera versus Squidward because at least we could hear a giant monster version of Squidward going, SpongeBob, Patrick, get out of my bedroom and give me back my tentacles. At least then it'd be funny. But here, the one monster battle that we have between Gamera and Virus is not very entertaining and not very well done. Even though this is the first time that Gamera has fought a tentacled foe, there's no suspense or debate about whether or not Gamera will win or lose against Virus. You take one look at the monster and just be like, oh yeah, Gamera definitely flattens this thing. And the way that he kills Virus is certainly unique and definitely deserves to be put on a t-shirt. The image of Gamera flying into the air and spinning like a top with Gamera still stuck into his shell, or not Gamera, Virus still being stuck into his shell. I mean, yeah, it's funny, but it's just one tiny speckle of corn in a sea of shit. And of course, this movie commits a huge sin for Showa era monster movies and features a whopping 15-minute long block of stock footage. Some of it being black and white stock footage from the original Gamera to showcase Gamera being mind controlled and destroying Japan. How cheap, how lazy, and how uninspired. How the hell Noriaki Yuasa considered this to be his favorite Gamera film, I have no idea how, I have no idea why, and I have no idea of understanding that. Yeah, Virus is... Oh, and also the commentary for this... Hello. Pardon Meadow, she just got home. The commentary for the Arrow set, I mean, was kind of entertaining enough, and not quite as much as Zigra, but towards the end of it, you could kind of tell that the two commentators were sort of struggling to come up with stuff to talk about because the movie is just such a snooze. Yeah, Gamma versus Virus just sucks. I would have an extremely difficult time finding any reason or any motivation to sit through it again. I will, though, say that at least it is boring, but it's not coma-inducingly boring like Gamera versus Zigra. Not by a whole lot, but still enough. I managed to sit through it in one sitting, though by the end of it, I was just like, oh my god, just end this already, please. Where's Roman?
Right here.
Oh. Coming in at number 11 is Gamera Rebirth. I just can't get behind this one. This is not to sound entitled or snobby or fanboyish or anything, but seriously, after 17 years, this was the best that Kadokawa could have done. The same writers and same director as the Godzilla Earth trilogy, which they should have learned by now is not a very well-received trilogy of films, using either the same animation style or a very similar animation style as the Godzilla Earth trilogy, which again has not really been the most well-received by monster movie fans. Rehashing so many elements from the Showa series and the Heisei trilogy, rehashing 5 previous monsters. Really? This is the best that you can give us after 17 years? Nah, I'm sorry. Not to sound like one of those super entitled fans, but you guys had 17 years to get your shit together and finally put your heads together and be like, you know what? Fuck it. Monster movies are back. People want to see monster movies. People want to see Gamera. It's been long enough. Let's give them something to make up for the near 2-decade-long hiatus. But no, this is the best that they could give us. And no, I'm just not going to accept it. So, granted, yeah, there is a little bit of, like, there is some fun Easter eggs. You can tell that the writers and directors were Gamera fans. There is a couple decent monster action scenes. The selection of Gamera kaiju is entertaining to see, even though I still am very disappointed they did not bring back Barrigan, as Barrigan's arguably my favorite Gamera kaiju. And the redesigns all look really cool, especially Guiron's, which is probably my favorite redesign of all the Gamera kaiju. And Gamera himself is really cool. He feels like a big badass mammoth of destruction, but still there's just too many problems, too many issues, and too much wasted potential for me to really enjoy this series. And it also has one of the most paper thin and bland, boring human cast of characters I've ever seen in any monster movie or show. So, yeah, I can't do this one. Gamma Rebirth just sucks. Coming in at number 10 is Gamera versus Guiron. I can't really lie to myself anymore with this one. So, like, yeah, I guess it is. It's hard to really call Gamera versus Guiron an improvement over Gamera versus Virus because Gamera versus Virus is just so low on the good spectrum. And then when you go to Guiron, a lot of people say Guiron is a big improvement over Virus. And I only partially agree because Virus is so bad. At least there there was some effort that was put into Guiron. And yeah, it is a more imaginative movie compared to Gamma versus Virus. It is somewhat a more enjoyable film compared to Gamma versus Virus. But again, that's only due to default because Guiron is not as boring, not as hackneyed, and not as uninspired, and also not quite as annoying. But all of this is not by a whole lot because I still think Gamma versus Guiron is just not that great. The highlight of the movie is, of course, Guiron himself. The same thing that people can say about Gamera versus Zigra. At least Zigra is a cool monster, and he's the big thing to focus on. I think Gamera versus Guiron is a much bigger example of that opinion. Guiron himself is definitely the highlight of the movie, and watching Guiron do Guiron things that Guirons all do is entertaining. Because that's one thing that he has over Zigra. Zigra is just a very bland and basic alien invader. Guiron is a big giant green lizard version of Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh with a giant machete on his head, chopping up monsters like pepperoni at a deli. Yeah, I'll take that any day over just a silver alien goblin shark swimming around looking menacing. Nah. So, yeah, Guiron is a lot of fun to watch. And Gamera, I suppose, is also a lot of fun to watch. But it's just a shame that the movie around them is just so shitty. The special effects are extremely inconsistent. Again, like Gamera versus Zigra, it's leaning more so on the negative side. Like there are some okay miniatures, there are some okay um, map and composite shots. There's some okay suitimation. There's some okay gore effects, but that's about it. The monster fights all suck. They're all way too long, way too drawn out, very lethargic, and very just poor, in my opinion. Again, the special effects are very inconsistent. There's a lot of really bad prop effects. There are some pretty bad compositing shots, and there's some horrendous blue screen work, which kind of seemed to get worse and worse as the show series went on. Yeah, this movie is just not an entertaining film, really, at all for me. And also the human characters, the mothers are all uber bitches. The Japanese boy in this movie, Akio, is also kind of an asshole. And his sister is kind of an annoying, screechy little brat. Yeah, Gamma versus Guiron is just not a fun movie. It does fall into the so bad it's good category. Like it would be prime material for Mystery Science Theater 3000, which of course led to the infamous quote when they actually did do an episode on Gamma versus Guiron. You know, guys, it just occurred to me how weird this film is, you know? Yeah, it's kind of goofy. I mean, sure, it works, but I don't like this movie very much. I'm sorry. It also didn't have a very good commentary for the Arrow set. Excuse me. Coming in at number 9, this is the one that most people would put at the very bottom of the series. Why? Oh, is he? So late? Okay. So yeah, this being the one that most people would put at the bottom of their list, that would be Gamera Super Monster at number 9. This surprised even me because I actually did kind of enjoy this movie upon my most recent viewing, mostly for ironic reasons. The commentary for the Arrow set was pretty entertaining to listen to. The guy who did it was kind of subtly roasting the movie the entire time while also giving some informative production details, but he was just kind of saying, damn, how the hell did this movie get made? And that really is a big question. So, in a similar vein to Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, which is an odd comparison, I know, but this movie is kind of an interesting case study. And like you can just kind of, if you try to watch it seriously and try to take it seriously as a Gamera film or even just a monster movie, you will hate it. And many criticisms that are thrown at this movie, I do agree with, and I do think are all valid. Probably any criticism that you could throw at this movie, I would agree with. Now, one positive I can give this is all of the stock footage. Now, again, this is a 92-minute long monster movie, and they use 32 minutes of stock footage to pad out its runtime. But one compliment I can give is that unlike Gamera versus Virus, the way the stock footage is used is a little smarter. They do, of course, reuse the same clips from Gamera, the giant monster, like they used in Gamera versus Virus, reusing black and white stock footage, but at least they showcase it on a TV. So they kind of make it look like the TV just had the color taken out of it because it's kind of a reddish color. So it's still stupid and asinine, but at least it was done in a bit of a smarter way. And all of the stock footage is edited down. It kind of feels like a montage rather than just lifting wholesale scenes from previous Gamera films minus the human characters and just shoving them into the movie's runtime. Like what they were doing in Gamera versus Virus, because that's one big reason that made it so boring in Gamera versus Virus is that they took entire scenes from previous Gamera films, filler and all. Whereas with Gamera Super Monster, they chop out all of the dead space and they chop out all of the filler scenes, so it's just go, 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 so that it moves at a much quicker pace, which is especially appreciated for all of the Gamera versus Guiron stock footage, which, as I mentioned, one of the biggest issues with that movie is that for the monster fights, there's so many long and lingering shots that just go on and on and on and on, and it gets so old and so grating. Both Gamera Super Monster, all that dead space is cut down, so the fight scenes move at a better pace. Not a good pace, but at least it's better. But like what I was saying, this movie, if you watch it seriously as a monster movie and as a Gamera movie, you will hate it. But retracting a statement that I've made in the past, I actually do think this movie could be enjoyed if you sit down with a bunch of friends and just riff a bad movie. Because this, again, I'm surprised this movie didn't get a episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000. It's interesting to sit back and just watch this movie and marvel at every single decision that was made during the filmmaking process. Ripping off Star Wars with Xanon's spaceship doing the opening Star Wars ship crawl in the beginning of the original Star Wars. ripping off Superman and Wonder Woman with terrible green screen effects and terrible wire effects that would make even Superman 4 blush. And extremely lazy and extremely hackneyed alien invasion plot that also does rip off what they were doing with Gamera versus Virus and a little bit of Gamera versus Zigra, taking 32 whole-ass minutes of stock footage from the previous 7 Gamera films to pad out its runtime. Literally any and every decision that was made regarding this movie, it's just kind of interesting and fascinating to sit back and just be in awe. Like, think, wow, people actually thought that this movie was a good idea, and people actually thought that this movie would have made money. And it didn't, of course, which rightfully so, because this movie is terrible. It's poorly made. It is boring in a lot of ways. It's nonsensical, and it's a complete pile of cockadookey bullshit. That being said, it is kind of an enjoyable pile of cockadookey bullshit. So there's that. And again, a fun audio commentary. I think, admittedly, too, that was a big reason why I enjoyed this recent rewatch. And it kind of like with Gamera versus Virus, which is a weird positive comparison. I sat through Gamera Super Monster in one sitting, and I wasn't really bored. Wasn't entertained necessarily, but at least I wasn't bored. Coming in at number 8 is Gamera 3, Revenge of Iris, the first real head-turning decision, I'm sure. Now, I have gone on record quite a few times saying how much I dislike this movie, which I still do stand by. I do think that this... Hello. I do think that this is one of the most overrated installments of the entire Gamera franchise. And especially, I do think that it's one of the most overrated and overhyped and over-bloated monster movies in the entirety of the kaiju genre. But it's not a bad movie necessarily. I just can't enjoy it the same way that everybody else does. And a lot of it is simply because of, well, there's a lot of reasons. Gamera doesn't have a whole lot of screen time, and I'd actually say this might be the worst of the entire Gamera franchise with how much this movie underuses its title character. The monster fights aren't as awesome as the previous 2 Gamera films. I'd actually say they're quite poor, almost. The special effects are really good, but I think that they suffer from Koichi Kawakita syndrome, in where they focused too much on cosmetics and appearances over practicality for the monster fights, because they're very sluggish and lethargic and very uninteresting and honestly unenjoyable. The film is very bleak and dark in not a very fun way. It almost feels like a prelude to a kaiju apocalypse, also not in a fun way. But the biggest reason that this movie just doesn't work for me is because of the main character, Ayana. I just cannot sympathize with this chick. You can write a 3,000 page long thesis explaining why Ayana is one of the most complex, interesting, and engaging characters in any monster movie, and you still can't change my mind. I cannot sympathize with this chick. I understand that she's angry. I understand that she's a teenager. I understand that she lost her family in a monster attack. But, and to a certain extent, I could see her harboring a resentment for Gamera. Like, this concept has never, or like has been done before and is nothing new for the kaiju genre, about a character losing a loved one in a kaiju attack and harboring some resentment for either Godzilla or Gamera in this case. So it's nothing new, but I think this is the absolute worst and most exaggerated example of PGSD, post Gamera stress disorder, or post kaiju stress disorder, as I call it. Yeah, she kills too many people. She's too off-putting. She's too unlikable. She's just too problematic for me to sympathize with. I'm not sorry. Again, you can make up any excuse or explanation why Ayana is such an engaging character. I don't agree. You can't change my mind. I just cannot sympathize with her. I can't get behind this chick. I just can't. I've tried. Now, again, this isn't a bad movie. It does also have an enjoyable commentary with Steve Reifel and Ed Goczewski, which did reveal a lot of interesting production details. But yeah, I'm sorry to say, but I'm also not sorry to say that Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris is just not one of my favorites. The only reason that I give it some praise is that it's not a bad movie. It is well made. It's got some high production values. It's got a big budget, but I just don't particularly care for it. And also, this is one of the biggest things that makes me so angry. It's got one of the most infuriating bullshit cliffhanger endings I've ever seen for any monster movie in the last 25 years. Let's say 30 years now. Yeah, I just can't dig it. I'm sorry. Fuck this. I really wish that we could see that fan-made Gamera 4 truth film, but in yet another example of how, in my opinion, it feels like Kadokawa is intentionally gatekeeping Gamera for its audience. To this day, that film has never been released on any kind of home video, and I think it's a big shame. So, fuck you, Kadokawa. Granted, too, it sounds like that movie would have ended in also a pretty unsatisfying way. But still, I would still like to see it. Why the fuck not? It is not a legit sequel to Gamera 3, so it offers some kind of continuation for this cliffhanger, but no. They want to be assholes. So fuck you. Moving on to number 7 is Gamera versus Jiger. I do still stand by the opinion that, yes, Gamera versus Jiger, it is an improvement over the last 2 films. It is an entertaining monster movie. If you just want to see a monster fight movie, this movie will wet your whistle. It's got 3 fight scenes, some pretty entertaining monster destruction scenes. The final time that we would see this for 24 years come Gamera Guardian of the Universe. It's got a fun and entertaining and engaging monster for Gamera to fight. It's got a new slick design, which, by the way, I have nicknames for all the Gamera designs. For every design, which the design in Gamera versus Jiger and Gamera versus Zigra I call Snaky Gammy, because Gamera does look kind of snake-like, but I actually sort of do prefer this design over the previous Gamera design used for Gauss, Virus, and Guiron, which I call Piggy Gammy, because Gamera has kind of like an upturned pig snout. But yeah, Gamera's got a sleek design that looks better, in my opinion. And this is really the last time that the Gamera, even though there was only one more film after this, this is like the last hoorah for the Gamera franchise to be good and somewhat enjoyable. Although the commentary for this movie, for the Arrow set, was not good at all. It was very, very uninteresting and very lethargic, in my opinion. So yeah, if you just want to see a basic monster fight movie. Again, there's 3 monster battles, a fun monster for Gamera to go up against, plenty of monster gore, and a surprising and kind of brutal method of Gamera killing the title monster, then this movie will wet your whistle. But therein also kind of lies the big main problem with Gamera versus Jiger, is that this movie just screams of rehash. So many elements in this movie are rehashed from previous Gamera films. A monster fight movie with Gamera just fighting another giant monster 3 times, that's Gamera versus Gauss. It has a similar tone to Gamera versus Gauss too. A monster that fires a big energy ray from its body that disintegrates things. That's Barugan's rainbow beam from Gamera versus Barugan. You have a monster that stems from an ancient civilization. That's kind of an amalgamation of what they do for Gamera and Barugan. You have a monster that fires projectiles out of its face. That's taken from Gamera versus Guiron. So much of this movie is stolen from previous Gamera films that at this point, it just feels a bit stale. But if you just are a huge Gamera fan and you want to focus on the good films in the Gamera franchise, this definitely is one to watch. It is somewhat well made. It is somewhat entertaining. And like I said, it is a big improvement over Virus and Guiron. So there is that. So I'm not going to knock it for being an entertaining monster fight movie. If that is what you want, this movie will wet your whistle. But I think it's executed at the barest minimum level of good. So that's why it is the definitive middle of the Gamera ranking list. And it is the most definitive. Fuck my nose. It is the definitive most middle of the road Gamera film. Coming in at number 6, funny, speak of the devil, is Gamera Guardian of the Universe. Now, I do also still think that Gamera Guardian of the Universe is almost in some ways, no, in many ways actually more overrated than Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris. People hail this movie as being one of the best monster movies of the entire kaiju genre. And certainly they hail it as one of the best, if not the best film in the entire Gamera franchise. Now, I do see why. And as I've mentioned back in 2023, once upon a time, I really disliked this movie for those reasons. Now, I do not think this way anymore. I do think that Gamera Guardian of the Universe is a good movie. And especially compared to the last couple installments of the Showa series, obviously, yes, it is a huge, huge improvement. But still, in my opinion, it is very overrated. And that's really, I don't think it's a bad movie at all. It's a fantastic reboot for Gamera. It is a fantastic monster movie. If you want to see it as a remake of Gamera versus Gauss, it's obviously a fantastic remake. And of course, it is a fantastic relaunch of the entire Gamera franchise, bringing Gamera to the 90s era of kaiju and tokusatsu fans in a very good way, and in a very entertaining way, and in a very well-made way. But just for me, I just think it's very overrated. That's the biggest thing that holds it back. There are some effects flubs too, like there's some bad CGI missiles. I do think that the film is too short. I think it should have at least been like an hour and 45 minutes. The monster fights are too short and kind of lethargic, in my opinion. Specifically, the land battles at the very end between Gamera and Gauss, where it just consists of Gamera kind of nudging himself against Gauss and pushing her along. Same issue could be said for the fights between Gamera and Iris. Well, it's even worse in that film. Oh, which by the way, well, hang on. Let me finish this real quick. And going back to the effects, definitely the weakest effect in this movie is all the composite shots. They don't use them very often. And during the final fight between Gamera and Gauss, because it's a big aerial dogfight and that kind of thing hadn't really been done before, it's understandable for why it looks the way it does, but the compositing effects for that final duel is still not that great, unfortunately. But again, they don't focus on it very much, which is good. And to give some praise, of course, we do have the reintroduction of Gamera in a pretty badass and admittedly kind of cute design, which I call Birdie Gammy, because the Gauss are like birds. So, and this is the one where the Gauss get the most focus. So, yeah, Birdie. And he also has big bug eyes, which I really do like. See, I like Gamera's design in this movie. I like Gamera himself too, and I do prefer the Heisei version. No, I don't know. I think I like the Heisei version of Gauss as much as the Showa version of Gauss, specifically from Gamera versus Gauss. Here, they feel more like legit threats, but Gauss, I feel like, has more of a personality in Gamera versus Gauss, but more on that in a little bit. So yeah, Gamera Guardian of the Universe, it is a good movie. It is an enjoyable monster film, and it has a fun commentary by Matt Frank of all people, which is pretty enjoyable and informative to listen to. But yeah, I just still think that Guardian of the Universe is just so overrated. They're in a similar vein, although I like Guardian of the Universe way more than these movies. It's kind of like King Kong and the original Gojira. I just like, in this case, 5 other Gamera films more than this. But that's not taking anything away from Guardian of the Universe. It is a good movie. I just like more, even more so. Coming in at number 5 is Gamera the Giant Monster. Now, if you remember in my speech, I said 5 out of the 12 Gamera films I consider to be some of my favorites. So I am going back to that mindset that I had in 2018 in considering Gamera the Giant Monster to be one of my favorite monster movies, which, yeah, I'm just not going to deny it anymore. Yes, I do consider it to be one of my favorite monster movies. It is kind of a problematic favorite because the original Gamera, the design of which I call OG Gammy, and by the way, so far we have Snaky Gammy, Piggy Gammy, Annie Gammy from Gamera Rebirth, because duh, of course. And for Gamera 3, I call that design Stumpy Gammy. Then we had Birdie Gammy, and now we have OG Gammy. Gamera himself has a good design, which I really do like. It looks like a giant turtle, looks like a giant kaiju turtle. But the suit itself is at times it looks kind of rough around the edges, specifically in the arms, because you could tell they were kind of sewn and plastered together with pieces. Yeah, this movie does have some flaws. It is very derivative of the original Gojira, as we've discussed many times. When the film is focusing on Gamera, it's 10 times more entertaining. But when it focuses on Toshio, one of the most annoying motherfucking kid characters in any monster movie ever made, it's really hard to watch at times. And his motivations for wanting to protect Gamera and save him from being attacked by the military make no sense. There are a lot of effects flub, not a lot actually, but there are some effects flubs, namely, again, with the kind of hodgepodge Gamera suit. And a lot of times you could see the fire device inside Gamera's mouth when he's shooting his fire breath. It's got some pacing issues, but as well as its enjoyable commentary, I just kind of can't really deny I do like Gamera the Giant Monster. It is a fun, generic, yes, and a lot of the same criticisms that are said for Varan the Unbelievable, you could say for Gamera the Giant Monster. I mean, the title itself is also generic. Gamera the Giant Monster. But still, I like it. It's the first of the franchise. It introduces Gamera in a very fun and entertaining way. And as Bill Wurster said in his Gamera Palooza, the monster himself is 10 times better than the film around him. Excuse me. So if you want to watch this movie for Gamera, you will not be disappointed. It's a fun 60s monster movie. Coming in at number 4, this is probably a very surprising turnaround, is Gamera versus Gauss. Now, as I stated, I do think this was the peak of the Showa Gamera series. Afterwards, the series never got as fun and entertaining as this, even despite how hard Jiger tried. But this is the newest addition to my list of favorite monster movies. Now, it would be kind of low because I do still think there are some problems that Gamera versus Gauss has. It looks a bit cheaper compared to its predecessors. It brings back the kid element, although thankfully Eiichi is not nearly as annoying as Toshio. I'd actually say he's probably the least annoying child character of the Showa Gamera series. Showa specifically. Yeah, there are some effects flubs too. There's some bad miniatures. There's some crappy composite shots. But you know, I also just kind of can't really deny it anymore. Gamera versus Gauss is also a fun flick in a better way as opposed to Gamera versus Jiger. If you do want to watch a monster versus monster movie that has 3 entertaining monster fights and a somewhat engaging human story, at least when the humans are trying to fight back against one of the title monsters, this movie is entertaining as hell. It's got a fun monster in Gauss. This is the movie that starts to morph Gamera into the version that is widely recognized, big, lovable, child protecting giant monster that fights big bad monsters and gets fucked the fuck up in the process with spewing greenish blood all over the place and fighting monsters with ridiculous abilities. Although Gauss is kind of ridiculous, but I would say he's probably the most grounded, quote unquote, because he's just a giant reptilian vampire bat that sprays yellow extinguishing powder from his nipples and fires a yellow laser beam that cuts through things. Did I say he's the most grounded? Well, compared to something like Jiger or Barragan from the previous movie, Gauss does feel a bit more normal-ish, I suppose. I do still think that Gauss should not be considered Gamera's arch rival. I think that title is given to him only just by default because he's been in all 4 eras of Gamera. I still think Barragan should be Gamera's arch rival because Barragan feels like the ultimate antithesis to Gamera, but more on that later. But Gauss is still an entertaining foe for Gamera to go up against. All 3 monster fights in the film are entertaining to watch. There is a funny gag, if you know Brendan Tenold's videos. Gamera takes Gauss from behind. um, Yeah, Gamma versus Gauss is just an enjoyable monster movie. If you just want to sit down and watch a monster versus monster movie, and be entertained, this movie is entertained. In some ways, it kind of does feel like a bit of a drop off compared to um, Gamma versus Barrigan, but in some ways, it is an improvement. Because one thing that you can say about this is that at least Gamera does have more focus in the story, and he has more screen time. So that's a plus. Coming in at number 3 is, again, speaking of which, Gamera versus Barugan. Now, yes, let's get it out of the way right now. The biggest problem with this movie, aside from the crappy monster fights, or at least the very experimental monster fights between Gamera and Barugan, is the lack of Gamera. Again, I still do think Gamera 3 might be a bit more frustrating, and Gamera Rebirth is right behind it. But man, does this movie really suffer from the lack of one of its title characters. It's called Duel of the Monsters, Gamera versus Barugan. And Gamera himself has so little to do with this movie, it's not even funny. Barely 10 minutes of screen time in an hour and 40-minute long movie. Very disappointing. And especially when it's the first sequel and only the first, it's the second film in the franchise, but it's the first time that Gamera fights another monster. And A, he's so underused, but also B, he's just so generic in this movie. He's so much like Godzilla in the Showa series. It's just kind of disappointing that it really does feel like maybe the studio was wanting to just make another solo monster movie, but then at the last minute they decided, let's just make this into Gamera 2 and shoehorning Gamera after the fact. But outside of that, this is just a fantastic monster movie. I can't deny it. Even with the lack of Gamera, when Gamera is on screen, he is a complete badass and entertaining as hell to watch. And the highlight of the movie is Barugan himself. I am a huge fan of Barrigan. I do think that he's one of my favorite giant monsters of the entire kaiju genre. And I love his powers. I love his design. I do like that it seems like he was created to be kind of an antithesis to Gamera. Gamera wields fire as his weapon. Well, Barrigan has an attack that emits heat and is much more destructive, but Barrigan's ability that he's most well known for, well, actually, that probably still is the rainbow attack, but his freezing spray attack feels like the antithesis to Gamera. So that's why, in my opinion, that makes Barrigan Gamera's ultimate rival, because he has an attack that could easily put him out of commission. But despite that, he still continues to fight. Of course, we got some great city destruction scenes with Barrigan going on his various rampages. There's some really good special effects, some great explosions, some fun monster action, and a very engaging and entertaining human story that is very well done, very well written, well acted, and just entertaining as hell. This whole movie overall, in my opinion, is entertaining as hell. Gamma versus Barrigan, again, is one of my favorite monster movies of all time, and definitely is one of my favorite Gamera films. Love it. Coming in at number 2 is Gamera the Brave. Yep, this still is my second favorite. I really did Gamera the Brave, but it too, in some ways. By the way, I call the design for Gamera in Gamera versus Barrigan Angie Gammy, because Gammy is very angy throughout the entire movie. And I'm kind of torn between two nicknames for Gamera in Gamera the Brave. It's either Baby Gammy or Mikey Gammy, because I still stand by the opinion that Gamera looks like a kaiju version of Michelangelo, just without the orange headband. But yeah, Gamera the Brave, I really do dig and I really enjoy, but it is kind of a problematic favorite too. Though that's not mostly, it's not really due to any fault of its own. It just really is such a shame that this movie was released at the absolute worst possible time. Um, in the mid 2000s, as we've said many times, the kaiju genre hit its rock bottom. And um, after this movie came out, like the tokusatsu side of things, like, well, no, I can't even say that. Kamen Rider and Super Sentai still kept going on, but Ultraman took a huge hit after this because the same year Ultraman Mebius debuted, and after that came out, the Ultraman series would enter kind of a dark age for a little while. Hell, especially a year after this, we had Ultra 7X, which we've already established I don't like. King Kong would enter a 12-year hiatus following 2005's Peter Jackson's King Kong, and in 2004, Godzilla Final Wars flopped its way into the box office and put the Godzilla franchise in a 10-year hiatus. And in 2006, of course, this movie would also flop its way into the box office and put the Gamera franchise on its 17-year-long hiatus, which again, it's just such a shame. And it's a shame too, because I was talking about this with somebody. Something I've come to realize recently is that it's kind of a shame that for both Gamera and Godzilla, for Final Wars and Gamera the Brave, those two seem to be the movies where, in my opinion, they had perfected Sunimation. The Sunimation as a special effect had reached its peak where it looked its best, and it was at the best harmony with practical effects and computer effects. And it's just such a shame that when they managed to accomplish this peak, afterwards they would abandon practical effects in favor of CG effects in mainstream big budget future releases, which, of course, 10 years later, Godzilla 2014 would use computer generated effects for Godzilla. And in Gamera Rebirth, it was animated, but still CG animated. And also for the Japanese side too, in Shin Godzilla, they would abandon Sunimation because Hideaki Anno thought, or Shinji Higuchi thought, audiences would find Sunimation boring, which I call bullshit on. But yeah, it's a shame that they reached this huge peak where they perfected Sunimation. But I mean, if these two films were to be the final usage of Sunimation, they were good films to end on. Godzilla Final Wars is still my favorite Godzilla movie, and Gamera the Brave is my second favorite Gamera film. Gamera the Brave is also just so overlooked and underrated, and it's such a shame because it's a damn solid monster movie. For the most part, the monster fights aren't that entertaining and aren't that well done. The origin for Gamera and especially Zetus are left frustratingly vague and frustratingly ambiguous, which is irritating as fuck. Zetus himself is an extremely generic and basic monster. He really just should have been Berrigan. Or if they used Zetus, explain his origin a bit more and give him some more entertaining powers other than just a razor sharp extendable tongue, which is stupid and boring. But yeah, aside from that, I don't really have any other major issues. The effects are fantastic, even if the monster fights are kind of lame. The emotional connection between Toto slash Gamera and Toru, hands down the best child actor of the entire Gamera franchise. And actually, I didn't cry, but I almost did tear up at the very end when Toru said, Sayonara, Gamera. Kind of almost got me. Um, and the movie is also kind of funny at times. It's very cute and sweet and just a very enjoyable and entertaining movie. If you want to sit down and watch a monster movie that is for the entire family to enjoy, this is one of the best, if not the best, campy, family-friendly monster movies for anybody to watch. Gamera the Brave is just so underrated and so underappreciated. Love it. But then, of course, coming in at my number one, my absolute favorite of the entire Gamera franchise is Gamera 2, Advent of Legion. It's funny that we go from the kind of least action-packed installment of the entire Gamera franchise at my number two, and then number one is arguably the number one most action-packed installment. I mean, I guess Super Monster does have a lot of action, but most of it's stock footage. But yeah, I would definitely say Advent of Legion is probably the most action-packed installment of the entire Gamera franchise. The effects are fantastic, barring some crappy CGI. I find the story to be much more entertaining and engaging than Guardian of the Universe. The main characters are kind of basic, but they're still way more enjoyable than Ayana from Gamera 3. I dig the monsters. I love insect kaiju. I think that makes them very intimidating and threatening foes. The alien invasion side of things does feel a bit familiar from the Showa series, but at least they do explain it in a way where they're not necessarily an intelligent species of aliens. They're an invasive species that comes from outer space, like an invasive species in our ecosystem, like Japanese salamanders in Chinese rivers, something like that. It's a species that's not supposed to be there, and it's invading other territory in order to further its own goals. So I like that little twist on the alien invasion side of things. Um, the music is really good, although I would probably say that no, I'm gonna say this is my favorite score that Kawatane did for the Heisei Gamera trilogy. It just sounds so bombastic and badass, and it just gets your blood pumping and it gets your adrenaline rushing. I love it. Um, and of course, Gamera himself, featuring my favorite design of the entire Gamera franchise, which I call Buggy Gammy, because bugs. He goes up against bugs in this movie. Gamera takes his most hellacious beating, but he unleashes my favorite killing move, his ultimate plasma attack, and has the most entertaining and bombastic monster fights of the entire Gamera franchise. I've said before that the Gamera franchise is not super well known for having the best monster fights, but this easily is the best of the best for the whole franchise. They're very, very dynamic, very explosive, very entertaining, and very vicious and brutal. Because again, Gamera takes the most hellish beating, but he also dishes out the most punishment for his antagonistic foe. Um, Queen Legion 2 is one of my favorite monsters of the entire franchise. She just looks so original. The effects are so complicated, but they're so cool to watch. Her fight scenes with Gamera are also, again, very entertaining. I love her design. I love the colors on her. I just love Queen Legion. So badass. Yeah, I love Gamera 2, Advent of Legion. Very, in some ways, it is kind of underrated, in my opinion, but Yeah, I love Gamera too. So enjoyable. Another one of my favorite monster movies of all time. So, god damn. That's it. That's my ranking of the Gamera franchise. Thank you all for being patient for my output of content. I know it's been extremely spotty this year, but I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to be consistent. Post your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share this video with your friends. And as always, look forward to future content. And as always, go out and watch some Gamera movies. And if you see a spinning, what looks like a spinning flying saucer that's emitting a distinctive sound, still run, because it probably means the giant monster's on the way. And I will see you guys in the next video.